As Republicans feel the pressure from Americans who want Congress to toughen gun laws in the midst of a spate of mass shootings across the country, House GOP lawmakers are trying to change the subject and falsely blame the left for mass shootings. The Tampa Bay Times obtained a memo of talking points put out by the House Republican Conference. This instructs members to deflect questions about the role of white nationalism in mass shootings, even though the facts tell us something very different, and so does the director of the FBI, Chris Wray. This is what he told Congress last month.
And I will say that a majority of the domestic terrorism cases that we've investigated are motivated by some version of what you might call white supremacist violence.
I wonder, Steve, why don't House Republican leaders want their rank and file conceding that white nationalism is at play when facts bear out that obviously it is?
Yeah, if you look at the memo, it's pretty clear that the talking points they've put forward is to shift the conversation from white nationalism and the rise in extremism to more of an argument of both sidesism. The question is, are you concerned about the rise in shootings by white nationalists? And they acknowledge, that white nationalism is a problem and something that, the country needs to face. But then it also shifts to the conversation to, quote, violence from the left, and goes on to falsely blame recent shootings like El Paso, as well as one in Colorado, and the shooting of Congresswoman Gabby Giffords on leftist extremism.
We actually have a graphic of that you just referenced, this quote from the talking point. So this is what it says here, exactly what Steve just laid out. So a spokeswoman for the House Republican Conference told the Times that the El Paso part's a typo, right? That it was supposed to say Dayton. But Steve, you point out in your report that, that aside, this isn't even correct when it comes to Dayton or when it comes to these other events that are referenced here in this defense and this shift away from white nationalism. Tell us about what you found.
Yeah, I think there's an important distinction to make, that someone's personal politics does not necessarily motivate these shootings or these actions. And in the case of what happened in El Paso, there is clear evidence that that individual committed that crime because of his beliefs about anti-immigration, and the rhetoric that he was spewing was echoing a lot of white nationalist sentiments. But in a lot of these other cases, while there is evidence that someone may have voted for a Democrat or supported certain politicians, the motivations of the crime are much less clear. And that's certainly the case so far in Dayton, and has been the case as we have investigated incidents in Colorado and Arizona and these other ones that have been ascribed to the left in this memo.
Facts matter, and people of America need to be able to believe what their leaders tell them. It is damaging to our democracy to spread information that, as you yourself just described, is baseless. There is no evidence of rampant voter fraud in 2016 or really in any previous election. People have studied this. Academics have studied this. Lawyers have studied this. The government has studied this. Democrats have studied this. Republicans have studied this. And no one can find any evidence of rampant voter fraud, either historically or particularly in the 2016 elections. I think it is damaging to our democracy to spread information like that if there is no proof. Now, if there is proof, then we really need to be taking action about that. These are serious allegations. Law enforcement should be involved. But if there is no proof, then these things really shouldn't be said.
Has the White House been responsive at all to your request for further information?
No, not so much.
Has the White House ever, and I mean including the commission chaired by Mike Pence, produced any evidence and handed it over to you, the Federal Election Commission, of fraud in New Hampshire or California or other places in 2016? No?
No, and I'm not aware of them handing any evidence over to the local law enforcement authorities who would have jurisdiction over what happened in their own states. It's, in fact, I've heard from folks at the state and local level who were offended by this. They thought that it was insulting to the way they ran their elections in each and every state to suggest that they would allow this kind of rampant voter fraud to go on. I've heard from people who said, I was at the polling stations. There were no buses. We didn't have room in the parking lots for these kinds of buses. And this kind of information, really, to put out information that has no proof, has no evidence behind it. It is, as I said, it's damaging to our democracy.
How?
It causes people to lose faith. It causes people to question the results. We have some serious threats to our democracy right now. There are threats from abroad that our national intelligence community has been warning about. There are bipartisan bills in Congress that cannot get votes, that cannot get through Congress, that would address the serious and real threats to our democracy. That's where we need to be focusing our attention, to be suggesting to people that if the candidate that they don't like doesn't win, if the candidate they choose doesn't win, that it's because of fraud. That undermines our democracy. It undermines people's faith. And once that faith is broken, it is very hard to build up again.
The president sending an outrageous, patently false tweet claiming that Google manipulated the 2016 election. This is what he wrote. Wow, report just out. Google manipulated from 2.6 million to 16 million votes for Hillary Clinton in the 2016 election. This was put out by a Clinton supporter, not a Trump supporter. Google should have sued. My victory was even bigger than thought. So just to be clear, there is no evidence Google manipulated votes. Joining me now is CNN's Daniel Dale, who's fact-checked just about every word the president has said since he's come to office. Daniel, what study is the president even talking about here?
So, John, he's talking about a study by a psychologist named Robert Epstein. And the problem with his tweet is that he's not only referring to a study whose conclusions are disputed, he's misdescribing the study itself. I spoke to Epstein a little bit earlier this afternoon. He said that he never alleged Google was, quote, manipulating votes. What he alleged was that bias in Google's search results may have affected as many as 10.4 million votes, between 2.6 million and 10.4 million votes in the 2016 election. He made clear he doesn't have evidence these votes were affected, but he said it might be up to about 10 million. So the 16 million number, it was conjured up by the president. Now, there are problems with the study itself, John. It's not just Trump's description. What Epstein did was ask people, basically a random selection of Americans, he crowdsourced this, to rate the alleged bias of the results that came up when they searched various election-related things on Google, Bing, and Yahoo, 3 search engines. So if it was pro-Trump, it would get a 5. If it was pro-Clinton, it would get a -5. And then he came up with a calculation of alleged bias. Now, the problem here that, as many political scientists have pointed out, is that by this calculation, a search engine that featured many articles by far-right website Breitbart, for example, which is reliably pro-Trump, would be rated as less biased against Clinton and more favorable towards Trump than a website that features, say, the New York Times or CNN. And people who observe journalism, mainstream readers, know that an investigative report by the New York Times is worth more in informational value than a puff piece from Breitbart. The second problem here is that Epstein presented no evidence that even if there were bias, votes were actually affected. What he did was look at his previous studies about elections in Australia and India, look at how votes were allegedly affected there, then apply his conclusions to the U.S. presidential election. And I spoke to a prominent political scientist, Michael McDonald, who studies elections, and said, well, American presidential elections are different beasts. Even if, people in an Indian election may have been affected one way, it's a different ballgame in an American presidential election where people know a whole lot about the candidates. So the president misdescribed the study, and the study itself has problems.
A surprising victory at the weekend box office. Good Boys stole the #1 spot.
Oh my God.
A view of $21 million its opening weekend. The movie, produced by Seth Rogen, is the first time that an R-rated comedy came in at #1 since The Boss in 2016. It's also the biggest opening for an original comedy this year. I think Hollywood has been experiencing a comedy drought. Yeah. So the fact that this one is doing so well, and it's a bunch of 12-year-old foul-mouthed kids making you laugh,
I'm in.
They're happy about it.